The Confederate raiders laughed as they surrounded the 3 Union scouts in the Tennessee woods. 7 against 3, odds that seemed impossibly stacked. "Throw down your weapons, Yankees," their leader sneered, "and we might let you live." But what the rebels didn't know was that each Union scout carried something revolutionary: a Colt Army Model 1860 revolver, 6 shots each. 18 rounds of rapid fire that would turn the tables in seconds. This is the true story of how new technology changed the face of cavalry warfare and saved 3 men who should have died that cold November morning in 1863. If you love untold stories from the Civil War and want to discover how technology shaped American history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the most dramatic moments of the war. Now let's get into this incredible story. Captain James Morrison of the 2nd Ohio Cavalry received his orders on November 12, 1863, at the Union camp outside Knoxville, Tennessee. General Ambrose Burnside needed intelligence on Confederate positions south of the Holston River, and Morrison's reputation as a skilled scout made him the obvious choice. The mission was straightforward but dangerous. Take 2 men, cross enemy territory, observe rebel movements, and return with actionable intelligence within 48 hours. Morrison chose his companions carefully. Sergeant Thomas "Tom" Bradshaw was a Kentucky frontiersman who could track a whisper through a thunderstorm. The 3rd man, Private Daniel Hayes, was barely 20 years old but possessed an uncanny ability to memorize terrain and troop positions with photographic precision. Together, they represented the Union cavalry's best, experienced, capable, and equipped with the latest military technology. Before dawn on November 13th, the 3 men saddled their horses and checked their equipment. Each carried standard cavalry gear: saber, Spencer carbine, and the weapon that would soon prove decisive: the Colt Army Model 1860 revolver. This .44 caliber percussion revolver was a marvel of modern engineering, capable of firing 6 shots without reloading. While Confederate cavalry often carried outdated single-shot pistols or relied on captured Union weapons, Northern scouts like Morrison's team had access to the best firearms American industry could produce. They crossed the Holston River before sunrise, the icy water reaching their stirrups as their horses waded through the shallows. Confederate territory lay ahead, a patchwork of farmland, dense forest, and winding creek beds where rebel cavalry patrols hunted for exactly the kind of intelligence-gathering mission Morrison's team represented. The 3 men knew the stakes. Capture meant imprisonment at best, execution as spies at worst. For the first day, their luck held. They moved like ghosts through the Tennessee wilderness, observing Confederate supply wagons, counting artillery pieces at a rebel battery, and noting the positions of infantry encampments. Hayes sketched maps, while Bradshaw identified unit insignias through his field glasses. Morrison coordinated their movements, keeping them just ahead of Confederate patrols. As darkness fell on their first night, they made a cold camp in a dense thicket of pines, not daring to light a fire that might give away their position. Morrison allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They'd gathered valuable intelligence, and if their luck continued, they'd be back across Union lines by tomorrow evening. He checked his Colt revolver one more time before sleeping, a ritual that would soon prove life-saving. The weapon was loaded, capped, and ready. In the cylinder sat 6 .44 caliber rounds that could fire as fast as a man could cock the hammer and pull the trigger. What none of them knew was that their presence hadn't gone completely unnoticed. A Confederate picket had spotted movement earlier that afternoon, just a glimpse of 3 riders where no friendly cavalry should be. He'd reported it to his sergeant, who reported it to Lieutenant Marcus Thornton, an ambitious young officer commanding a 7-man patrol of Forrest's cavalry raiders. Thornton saw an opportunity for glory and promotion. If he could capture Union scouts and recover their intelligence, his name would reach the ears of General Nathan Bedford Forrest himself. As Morrison's team slept in shifts, Thornton's raiders were already on their trail. The morning of November 14th broke cold and gray, with frost coating the fallen leaves. Morrison's team rose before dawn, their breath misting in the freezing air. They had perhaps 10 miles to cover before reaching the relative safety of Union-controlled territory north of the Holston River. The intelligence they carried could influence General Burnside's strategic decisions in the Knoxville campaign, information about Confederate supply lines, artillery positions, and troop strengths that might tip the balance in upcoming engagements. They rode cautiously through the dense Tennessee forest, following deer trails and creek beds to avoid open ground where they might be spotted. Sergeant Bradshaw took point, his experienced eyes scanning for signs of Confederate patrols. Private Hayes rode in the middle, his saddlebags heavy with maps and notes. Captain Morrison brought up the rear, occasionally glancing back to ensure they weren't being followed. Around mid-morning, they entered a particularly dense section of woodland, where ancient oaks and hickories created a canopy that blocked most of the pale sunlight. The undergrowth was thick with mountain laurel and rhododendron, limiting visibility to perhaps 20 yards in any direction. It was exactly the kind of terrain that made veteran soldiers nervous. Too many places for an enemy to hide, too little room to maneuver. Bradshaw raised his hand suddenly, bringing the small column to a halt. He'd heard something, a faint jingle of tack leather, the soft snort of a horse. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. They might have stumbled onto a Confederate patrol, or worse, been deliberately herded into this natural choke point. He was reaching for his Spencer carbine when the woods exploded with rebel yells. 7 Confederate cavalrymen burst from the undergrowth on 3 sides, forming a rough semicircle that cut off any escape route except straight ahead, where 2 more raiders appeared, blocking that avenue as well. Lieutenant Thornton, identifiable by the officer's braid on his slouch hat, sat his horse with the confidence of a man who knew he'd executed a perfect ambush. His raiders held their positions, weapons drawn, but not yet firing. They wanted prisoners, not corpses. "You boys are a long way from home," Thornton called out, his South Carolina accent thick as molasses. "I'm Lieutenant Marcus Thornton, Army of Tennessee. You're surrounded and outnumbered better than 2 to 1. Now I can see your cavalry scouts, which means you're carrying intelligence my commanding officers would very much like to see. You've got one chance to live through this morning. Drop your weapons and surrender. Otherwise, we shoot your horses out from under you and take what we want from your bodies." Morrison's mind raced through the options, none of them good. A breakout charge would likely get at least one of his men killed, possibly all 3. Surrender meant imprisonment, and the loss of crucial intelligence that could cost Union lives. His hand rested on his saddle pommel, inches from the holstered Colt at his hip. Beside him, Bradshaw and Hayes sat frozen, waiting for their captain's decision. "You're thinking about fighting," Thornton continued, almost conversationally. "Don't. I've got 7 men with loaded carbines pointed at your vital areas. You might get 1 or 2 of us, but you'll be dead before you clear those pretty Yankee revolvers from their holsters. Be smart. Live to see another day. Maybe you'll get exchanged in a prisoner swap." What Thornton didn't understand, what most Confederate cavalry didn't fully appreciate in late 1863, was the tactical revolution represented by the Colt Army revolver. While rebel cavalry typically carried single-shot pistols or outdated revolvers with complex reloading procedures, Union cavalry scouts had access to Colt's masterpiece of military engineering. Each of Morrison's men carried 6 shots that could be fired in rapid succession, 18 rounds total. Against 7 men, those were odds that could be worked with. Morrison caught Bradshaw's eye and saw the same calculation. The sergeant gave an almost imperceptible nod. Hayes, young and frightened but well-trained, tightened his grip on his reins. They all understood the signal that would come next. Morrison took a slow breath, his right hand still resting casually near his holster. When he moved, it would have to be faster than anything these rebels had ever seen. "All right, Lieutenant," Morrison said calmly, buying seconds. "You've got us fair and square. Just let me tell my men to stand down before somebody gets nervous and—" His hand flashed to his Colt revolver with practiced speed, and the morning air split with gunfire. The first shot from Morrison's Colt took Lieutenant Thornton completely by surprise. The Confederate officer had been expecting surrender, negotiation, perhaps even a desperate but futile breakout attempt with carbines. What he hadn't anticipated was the explosive speed with which Morrison's revolver cleared its holster and fired. The .44 caliber ball struck Thornton's horse in the chest, and the animal went down screaming, throwing its rider into the underbrush. In that same heartbeat, Bradshaw and Hayes drew their own Colts, and the forest erupted into chaos. The tactical advantage of the Colt revolver became immediately apparent. While Confederate cavalrymen scrambled to bring their single-shot pistols and carbines to bear, Morrison's team was already firing their second and third rounds. Bradshaw's shots took down 2 rebels on the left flank, 1 hit in the shoulder. The other's horse spooked by a near miss that sent the animal bolting through the trees with its rider desperately clinging to the saddle. Hayes, despite his youth and the terror hammering in his chest, performed exactly as his training had taught him. He fired methodically at the raiders to the right, forcing them to break formation and seek cover. His second shot shattered a rebel's carbine stock, sending splinters into the man's face and putting him out of the fight. His third shot missed, but the continuous fire kept the Confederates from organizing a coordinated response. Morrison fired his fourth and fifth shots in rapid succession, both aimed at the 2 raiders who'd been blocking their forward escape route. One took a hit in the thigh and wheeled his horse away, blood streaming down his leg. The other's horse reared at the sound of gunfire, nearly unseating its rider. In less than 10 seconds, Morrison's team had fired 15 shots and transformed a confident ambush into a deadly melee. "Break north!" Morrison shouted, spurring his horse forward through the gap where the forward raiders had been. Bradshaw and Hayes followed immediately, their horses leaping over fallen logs and crashing through the mountain laurel. Behind them, the remaining Confederate raiders were finally bringing their weapons to bear, but the Union scouts were already in motion, making themselves difficult targets in the dense underbrush. A carbine ball whistled past Morrison's ear, close enough that he felt the air displacement. Another shot struck a tree trunk inches from Hayes's shoulder, showering him with bark splinters. But the return fire was sporadic and poorly aimed. The rebels were still reeling from the shock of encountering rapid-fire revolvers. Most Confederate cavalry in 1863 had heard stories about Union Colts, but few had experienced their devastating effect in close-quarters combat. "Reload!" Morrison ordered as they crashed through a small creek, water spraying from their horses' hooves. All 3 men had fired most or all of their cylinders. Hayes had 1 shot left, Bradshaw was empty, and Morrison had his 6th round still loaded. Reloading a percussion revolver at full gallop was nearly impossible, but they needed to be ready if the rebels pursued. Behind them, Lieutenant Thornton was climbing out from under his dead horse, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. 2 of his men were wounded, 1 seriously. Another had been thrown from his spooked mount and was limping in circles, holding his arm at an unnatural angle, probably broken in the fall. The remaining 4 raiders looked to their lieutenant for orders, but Thornton was beyond rational thought. He'd had 3 Yankees dead to rights, and somehow they'd turned the tables with nothing but pistols. "After them!" Thornton screamed, pulling himself onto a riderless horse. "I want those scouts dead or captured! Move!" But Morrison's team had a head start now, and they were riding hard for Union lines. The forest blurred past them as they pushed their horses to the limit, leaping over obstacles and dodging between trees. Bradshaw, riding point again, found a game trail heading north, and the 3 men followed it at breakneck speed. Morrison risked a glance over his shoulder and saw 4 rebel riders in pursuit, perhaps 100 yards back and losing ground. Their horses were tired from the morning's ride, while Morrison's team had been conserving their mount's strength. Unless something went very wrong, they'd make it to friendly territory. 2 miles to the river, Bradshaw called back. There's a Union picket post at the ford. They had a chance. The intelligence would get through. But Thornton and his remaining raiders weren't giving up, and the chase through the Tennessee wilderness was far from over. The chase continued through increasingly rugged terrain as Morrison's team raced northward toward the Holston River and Union lines beyond. Their horses, while fresher than their pursuers, were beginning to tire from the sustained hard gallop through dense forest. Foam flecked their necks and their breathing came in great gasping heaves, but the riders pushed them onward, knowing that capture meant death or imprisonment. Behind them, Lieutenant Thornton and his 4 remaining raiders maintained pursuit with grim determination. The Confederate officer's pride had been wounded as badly as his men, and he burned with the need to redeem himself. He'd reported to his superiors that he was tracking Union scouts. Returning empty-handed would be humiliating, but returning with the news that 3 Yankees had shot their way through his 7-man patrol would be catastrophic for his military career. He drove his borrowed horse mercilessly, gradually closing the gap. The terrain began to change as Morrison's team descended toward the river valley. The dense forest gave way to more open woodland with better sight lines but fewer places to hide. Bradshaw navigated by instinct and memory, remembering landmarks from their outbound journey 2 days earlier. A distinctive lightning-struck oak, a collapsed settler's cabin, a distinctive rock outcropping. Each marker confirmed they were on the right path. "Captain!" Hayes called out, his young voice tight with stress. "They're gaining!" Morrison glanced back and cursed. The rebels had indeed closed the distance to perhaps 75 yards, within effective carbine range if they decided to stop and take aimed shots. But stopping would also mean losing the chase entirely, and Thornton seemed determined to run them down rather than risk another exchange of gunfire where the Union Colts could again prove decisive. As they burst from the tree line into a more open area of rolling meadows, Morrison made a tactical decision. "Bradshaw, Hayes, keep riding. Don't stop for anything. I'll slow them down." "Captain." "You can't—" Bradshaw started to protest. "That's an order, Sergeant. Get that intelligence to General Burnside." Morrison reined his horse to the right, separating from his 2 companions and angling toward a small rise that would give him elevation advantage. His Colt still held 1 shot, but more importantly, his Spencer carbine was loaded with 7 rounds in its tubular magazine. If he could buy his men 2 minutes, they'd be close enough to the Union picket post that the rebels would have to break off pursuit. Bradshaw and Hayes continued north, though both men looked back with anguished expressions. They understood the math of what Morrison was doing, sacrificing his escape to ensure theirs. Hayes, with maps and detailed intelligence notes in his saddlebags, represented the real prize. Morrison was covering the mission's success with his own life. As Morrison reached the small hill and wheeled his horse around, he saw Thornton make a split-second decision. The Confederate lieutenant pointed 2 of his men after Bradshaw and Hayes, while he and the other 2 raiders turned toward Morrison. Thornton had realized the same thing Morrison had. The intelligence was what mattered, and he was sending his best men after the real target while personally dealing with the Union captain. Morrison dismounted quickly, using his exhausted horse as cover while he brought the Spencer carbine to his shoulder. The 3 Confederate riders were closing fast, perhaps 50 yards away now. At this range, his Spencer's 7-shot capability gave him better odds than trying to reload his single-shot Colt Revolver. He aimed carefully at the lead rider, Thornton himself, and squeezed the trigger. The carbine bucked against his shoulder, and Thornton's horse stumbled, hit somewhere in the front quarters. The lieutenant managed to jump clear as his second mount in one morning went down beneath him. The other 2 raiders split left and right, making themselves harder targets while returning fire with their own carbines. A ball struck the ground inches from Morrison's boot. Another whistled overhead. Morrison worked the Spencer's lever action, chambering another round, and fired at the raider on his left. Miss. Another lever action, another shot at the right side raider. This one connected. striking the Confederate in the upper arm and spinning him partially out of his saddle. The man clung on desperately but was clearly out of the fight. That left Thornton, now on foot, but advancing with his pistol drawn, and one mounted raider who'd circled wide and was trying to flank Morrison's position. The captain fired at the mounted man, forcing him to veer away, then swung his carbine toward Thornton. Click! The Spencer was empty. He'd fired all 7 rounds. Morrison dropped the carbine and drew his Colt revolver, knowing he had only 1 shot left. Thornton, perhaps 20 yards away, raised his own pistol, an antiquated single-shot model that had to be individually capped and loaded. Both men fired simultaneously. Morrison felt something hammer into his left side, a crushing impact that knocked him backward. Thornton grabbed his leg with a shout of pain. Morrison's last shot had struck him just above the knee, shattering bone. Both men went down, one from bullet impact, the other from his wounded leg collapsing beneath him. The remaining mounted raider pulled up short. Looking between his wounded lieutenant and the fallen Union captain, clearly uncertain what to do next. In the distance, gunfire echoed from the direction Bradshaw and Hayes had fled. The 2 raiders pursuing them must have caught up. Morrison, gasping with pain and trying to assess his wound, saw with grim satisfaction that his 2 men had made it over another rise and out of sight. Even if the pursuing rebels caught them now, they were close enough to the Union picket post that the sound of gunfire would bring help. The intelligence would get through. Thornton, lying on the ground, clutching his shattered leg, locked eyes with Morrison across the 20 yards separating them. 2 men who'd been trying to kill each other moments before, now both wounded and helpless. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "You fight like a cornered wildcat," Thornton gasped through clenched teeth. Morrison pressed his hand against the wound in his side, feeling warm blood seeping between his fingers. "You chase like a damn bloodhound." The remaining mounted raider dismounted to help his lieutenant, and neither wounded man was in any position to continue fighting. The pursuit was over. The Union picket post at the Holston River ford exploded into action when Sergeant Bradshaw and Private Hayes came thundering across the shallow water with 2 Confederate raiders close behind. The blue-coated sentries had heard the distant gunfire and were already alert, their weapons ready. When they saw Union cavalry scouts being pursued by rebel riders, they opened fire immediately. The 2 Confederate raiders, already exhausted from the long chase and realizing they'd run straight into a hornet's nest of Union soldiers, wheeled their horses and retreated back across the river at full gallop. Within minutes, they disappeared into the Tennessee wilderness, their pursuit abandoned. The mission to capture the Union scouts and their intelligence had failed completely. Bradshaw and Hayes practically fell from their saddles, both men gasping for breath and looking back desperately toward where they'd left Captain Morrison. "Our captain. He stayed back to cover our escape," Bradshaw managed between breaths. "3 rebels were on him. We have to go back." The sergeant commanding the picket post, a grizzled veteran named O'Brien, quickly assessed the situation. He dispatched 2 riders north to the main Union lines with orders to bring back a cavalry patrol and a surgeon, then organized a rescue party of 6 men to return south with Bradshaw to find Morrison. They found the Union captain 20 minutes later, still conscious but pale from blood loss. He was sitting with his back against a tree, pressing a wadded piece of cloth from his own shirt against the wound in his side. His Colt revolver lay in his lap, unloaded but ready in case the Confederates returned. When he saw Bradshaw and the Union patrol approaching, Morrison's tense expression relaxed into something resembling relief. "Intelligence?" he asked weakly, his first concern still the mission. "Safe, sir," Bradshaw confirmed, dismounting quickly. "Private Hayes has it all. We made it through." Morrison nodded, then nearly passed out from the movement. The patrol's makeshift medic, a corporal with some battlefield experience, examined the wound and offered cautious optimism. "Ball went clean through, Captain. Missed anything vital, looks like. You'll be laid up for weeks, but you should recover if infection doesn't set in. Lieutenant Thornton and his wounded raiders weren't so fortunate. The mounted raider who'd witnessed the final exchange of shots had managed to fashion a tourniquet for Thornton's shattered leg, probably saving the lieutenant's life. They'd made their way back to their own lines, but Thornton's injury was severe enough that he would never ride cavalry again. His military career effectively ended in that Tennessee meadow, done in by his own obsessive pursuit and a Union captain's last pistol shot. By evening, Morrison was back at the Union camp outside Knoxville, being tended by actual surgeons who confirmed the field medic's assessment. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his side without hitting organs or breaking ribs. Painful and debilitating, but not fatal. He'd be in a hospital bed for several weeks. More importantly, Private Hayes's maps and intelligence notes were already in General Burnside's hands. The information about Confederate supply lines and artillery positions would prove crucial in the Knoxville campaign's next phase. The Confederate supply depot that Hayes had carefully mapped would be raided within the week, significantly hampering Southern operations in the region. The artillery battery positions Morrison's team had identified would be factored into Union tactical planning. The three men were officially commended for their actions. Morrison received a promotion to major when he recovered, though he bore a permanent scar and chronic pain from his wound. Bradshaw was given a field commission to lieutenant, recognition of both his scouting skills and his courage in completing the mission. Hayes, despite his youth, earned a reputation as one of the most reliable intelligence scouts in the Army of the Ohio. But the real story that spread through both armies was the firefight itself, how 3 Union cavalry scouts with Colt Revolvers had shot their way out of a 7-man Confederate ambush. For Union cavalry, it became a validating story about the effectiveness of their superior weaponry and training. For Confederate cavalry, particularly those still armed with older single-shot pistols, it became a cautionary tale about the changing nature of cavalry warfare. The percussion revolver, exemplified by the Colt Army Model 1860, was transforming how cavalry engagements were fought. The ability to fire 6 rapid shots without reloading gave Union cavalry a decisive advantage in close-quarters combat. Stories like Morrison's firefight circulated through military camps, reaching the ears of procurement officers and military planners on both sides. The Confederacy, with its limited industrial capacity, struggled throughout the war to equip its cavalry with comparable revolvers. Many rebel horsemen relied on captured Union weapons or outdated firearms that couldn't match the Colt's efficiency. This technological gap, while seemingly small, had significant tactical implications in hundreds of small skirmishes and scouting actions throughout the war's remaining years. In the grand narrative of the Civil War, Morrison's engagement with Thornton's raiders was a tiny footnote. 3 men escaping a bad situation, nothing that would appear in major history books. But for the soldiers involved, and for the cavalry tactics that evolved throughout 1863 and 1864, it represented something larger: how industrial capacity and technological innovation could tip the scales in individual combat encounters, and how those individual encounters could accumulate into strategic advantages. The story of Captain Morrison's team and their Colt Revolvers didn't end with their escape from Confederate raiders in November 1863. Instead, it became part of a larger transformation in how the Union cavalry fought and how they understood their own tactical advantages. Within weeks, Morrison's after-action report was being circulated among cavalry commanders throughout the Army of the Cumberland and the Army of the Ohio, serving as a case study in how properly equipped scouts could fight their way out of seemingly impossible situations. The technological revolution represented by the Colt Army Model 1860 and similar repeating firearms was gradually changing the calculus of cavalry warfare. Before the widespread adoption of revolvers and repeating carbines, cavalry had primarily served as reconnaissance, screening, and shock assault forces, roles that emphasized mobility and cold steel over firepower. But by late 1863, Union cavalry was evolving into a force capable of sustained fire while mounted or dismounted, creating tactical options that Confederate cavalry, with their often inferior weaponry, struggled to counter. General William T. Sherman, always attuned to technological advantages, noted in his correspondence that Union cavalry armed with Colt revolvers and Spencer repeating carbines could generate more firepower than similarly sized Confederate units by a factor of 3 or 4. This wasn't just theoretical. It played out in countless small actions throughout Tennessee, Georgia, and Virginia in the war's final years. Union cavalry scouts, couriers, and raiding parties survived encounters that would have been fatal without rapid-fire weapons. The Confederate response to this technological gap was hampered by the South's limited industrial capacity. While the Confederacy did produce some revolvers and captured many from Union forces, they never achieved parity in cavalry armament. Confederate cavalry commander Nathan Bedford Forrest, perhaps the war's most talented cavalry tactician, repeatedly complained about his men's inferior weapons, noting that individual courage and superior tactics could only partially compensate for the Union's firepower advantage. For Morrison, Bradshaw, and Hayes, their November morning firefight became a defining moment in their military service. Morrison, recovering from his wound at a military hospital in Cincinnati, received visits from officers wanting to hear firsthand about the engagement. His description of how the 3 Colts had created enough firepower to break contact with 7 attackers was discussed in cavalry officer training sessions. Bradshaw, now Lieutenant Bradshaw, used his newfound reputation to push for better equipment and training for reconnaissance units. He argued persuasively that scouts armed with the best available revolvers and carbines could accomplish missions that would otherwise require larger forces, and that the investment in superior weapons paid dividends in mission success rates and scout survival. His recommendations influenced procurement decisions in his sector of operations. Hayes, the youngest of the 3, became something of a minor celebrity among Union cavalry scouts. His coolness under fire at age 20, combined with the intelligence he'd successfully delivered, made him a model for how young soldiers could perform when properly trained and equipped. He continued his scouting work throughout the war, surviving several more close calls, but never again finding himself in quite so desperate a situation as that November morning in Tennessee. The broader legacy of encounters like Morrison's firefight was the Union cavalry's growing confidence and effectiveness in the war's final 18 months. By 1864, Union cavalry was regularly besting Confederate horsemen in both small-scale skirmishes and large engagements. While factors like superior numbers and better-fed horses certainly contributed, the firepower advantage provided by revolvers and repeating carbines was undeniable. Union cavalry raids deep into Confederate territory became increasingly bold and successful, disrupting Southern supply lines and communications. The technological lessons learned during the Civil War extended far beyond the conflict itself. The demonstrated effectiveness of rapid-fire weapons influenced military procurement and tactics for generations. The revolvers that saved Morrison's team in 1863 were direct ancestors of the firearms that would arm cavalry forces worldwide for the next half-century. The tactical principle that individual soldiers, equipped with rapid-fire weapons, could hold their own against larger forces, would shape military thinking through both world wars. For the 3 men who rode through Tennessee that November morning, the war eventually ended as it did for millions of others. Morrison mustered out in 1865 with his major's rank intact, returned to Ohio, and lived another 40 years, though he walked with a slight limp and his wounded side ached in cold weather. He rarely spoke about the war, but he kept his Colt Army revolver cleaned and oiled in a place of honor in his home, the weapon that had saved his life. Bradshaw remained in the Army after the war, serving on the frontier and eventually retiring as a captain. He trained cavalry scouts for another 15 years, always emphasizing marksmanship, quick thinking under pressure, and the importance of superior equipment. His students went on to fight in the Indian Wars, carrying his lessons about the decisive advantage of rapid-fire weapons into new conflicts. Hayes returned to Pennsylvania after the war, married, raised a family, and worked as a surveyor, his wartime skill at map-making translating well into civilian life. He remained in touch with Morrison and Bradshaw through occasional letters, and the three veterans reunited several times at regimental gatherings. At these meetings, other veterans would inevitably ask them to recount the story of the ambush, the firefight, and the chase to Union lines. Their story, while small in the grand scope of the Civil War, encapsulated something essential about how the conflict was fought and won. The Union's industrial capacity didn't just produce more soldiers, food, and supplies. It produced better tools for the individual soldier. A cavalry scout with a Colt revolver was simply a more capable combatant than one with a single-shot pistol, and that individual advantage, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of engagements, contributed meaningfully to the war's outcome. The Confederate raiders who mocked 3 Yankee scouts that November morning learned a hard lesson about technological change in warfare. In the time it took them to aim and fire their single-shot weapons, Morrison's team unleashed 18 rounds of rapid fire that transformed a certain capture into a desperate escape. Lieutenant Thornton carried the physical and professional scars of that encounter for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder that in the modern warfare of the 1860s, the side with better technology held advantages that courage alone couldn't overcome. The sound of those Colt revolvers echoing through the Tennessee forest represented more than just one firefight's thunder. It was the sound of warfare changing, of industrial capacity becoming as decisive as individual valor, of a new era in which the tools a soldier carried could matter as much as the courage in his heart. For 3 Union scouts riding for their lives, those 18 shots spelled the difference between death and survival, between mission failure and success, between becoming forgotten casualties and living to tell a story that would echo through cavalry tactics for years to come. Epilogue: Reunion at Shiloh. 32 years after that desperate firefight in the Tennessee woods, 3 old men stood together at Shiloh National Military Park on a warm April afternoon in 1895. Major James Morrison, now 68 years old with silver hair and a walking stick to ease the chronic pain in his left side, gazed across the peaceful battlefield where thousands had died decades earlier. Beside him stood Captain Thomas Bradshaw, retired from frontier service, his weathered face bearing the deep lines of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. Private Daniel Hayes, now a prosperous surveyor with grown children of his own, completed the trio. The 3 veterans had gathered for the dedication of a new monument, but their real purpose was simpler: to stand together once more, survivors of a war that had claimed 600,000 American lives. Around them, hundreds of other veterans milled about, men in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, wearing faded blue or gray uniforms that no longer fit quite right around expanding waistlines. Former enemies shook hands, shared tobacco, and swapped stories that time had softened into something approaching fondness. "You still have it?" Bradshaw asked Morrison, nodding toward the leather case the former captain carried. Morrison opened the case carefully, revealing the Colt Army Model 1860 revolver that had saved his life in November 1863. The weapon was immaculately maintained, its metal surfaces gleaming despite their age, the walnut grips worn smooth from handling. He'd carried it through the rest of the war, and then kept it afterward, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the morning when 18 rounds of rapid fire had meant the difference between death and survival. "Never could bring myself to put it away permanently," Morrison admitted. "Cleaned it every month for 32 years. My wife thinks I'm foolish, keeping a weapon from a war I claim to want to forget." Hayes laughed softly. "My children ask me about the war sometimes. They want to know if I was brave, if I was scared, if I killed anyone. I never know quite what to tell them. How do you explain that morning to someone who wasn't there? 3 men against 7, and we rode away. On paper, it sounds impossible. Wasn't impossible, Bradshaw said quietly. Was technology, and training, and a lot of luck. He paused, looking out over the battlefield. But mostly it was those Colts. 6 shots each, fired as fast as you could cock the hammer. Thornton and his boys never had a chance once we started shooting. The 3 men fell silent, each lost in their own memories. Around them, the reunion continued, former soldiers laughing, crying, embracing. A Confederate veteran with an empty sleeve clasped hands with a Union veteran missing a leg. A photographer was setting up his equipment to capture images of aging warriors who'd soon be gone forever. "Do you ever wonder what happened to Thornton?" Hayes asked suddenly. "The lieutenant who chased us?" Morrison nodded slowly. "I looked into it, actually. After the war, through veteran associations. He survived the war but never recovered from that leg wound. Walked with crutches the rest of his life. Died in South Carolina in 1889, just 6 years ago. Pneumonia." He paused. His obituary mentioned he'd been a cavalry officer. Didn't mention our little encounter, of course. "He was just doing his job," Bradshaw said without malice. "Same as we were. He was brave enough, pushing that pursuit even after we bloodied his nose in the ambush. Different circumstances, he might have been wearing blue instead of gray, and we might have been the ones doing the chasing." Morrison carefully returned the Colt to its case. "The guns made the difference. I've thought about that a lot over the years. Thornton had more men, probably more field experience than Hayes here, and he executed a perfect ambush. By all rights, we should have died in those woods or spent the rest of the war in a Confederate prison. But we had Colts, and he didn't, and that was enough." "Industrial capacity won the war," Hayes said, echoing what he'd heard historians and veterans say countless times. "The North had more factories, more railroads, more of everything, including better revolvers." "Maybe so," Morrison replied. "But that November morning, it wasn't industrial capacity in the abstract. It was 18 rounds we could fire without reloading. It was Thornton hearing that rapid fire and realizing he'd miscalculated. It was you, Tom, putting down 2 men in 3 seconds because your Colt could fire as fast as you could pull the trigger." He looked at his old companions. "The North might have won anyway, eventually. But we 3 survived because some genius in Connecticut figured out how to make a reliable 6-shot revolver." The ceremony was beginning, speeches about reconciliation, about brave men on both sides, about healing the nation's wounds. The 3 Union veterans found seats together, old bones grateful for the rest. As a former Confederate general spoke about honor and brotherhood, Morrison's hand rested on the leather case containing his revolver. He thought about the young captain he'd been, frightened and determined in equal measure, making split-second decisions that would mean life or death. He thought about the sound of Colt revolvers firing in rapid succession, thunder in a Tennessee forest that changed 7-3 odds into something survivable. He thought about Lieutenant Thornton, dying years later of pneumonia, probably never knowing that the Union captain who'd shot him had thought about him, had learned his fate, had acknowledged his courage even across the divide of war and allegiance. The war had been about slavery, about union, about economics and politics and all the great forces that historians would debate forever. But on one cold November morning in 1863, it had also been about 3 men with better revolvers fighting their way clear of an ambush. Both things were true. Both things mattered. As the speeches concluded and the crowd began to disperse, the 3 old scouts stood together one final time, looking out over the Shiloh battlefield, where spring grass now grew green over ground that had once run red with blood. "Same time next year?" Bradshaw asked, though they all knew the odds of all 3 surviving another year were diminishing. "If we're able," Morrison replied. if we're still here." They shook hands. Three men who'd shared a moment of desperate violence 32 years earlier, bound together by memory and survival, and the peculiar brotherhood of men who'd faced death together and lived to grow old. Then they parted, each heading back to wives and children and grandchildren, carrying with them the weight of history and the strange knowledge that sometimes the course of a life, or a war, could turn on something as simple as 6 chambers in a rotating cylinder. Morrison kept his Colt revolver until his death in 1902, and it was buried with him at his request. Bradshaw and Hayes both attended the funeral, the last 2 survivors of that November morning. They stood together at the graveside, old men remembering youth, and neither needed to speak the thoughts they shared. The revolver that had saved their captain's life, and by extension their own, now rested with him forever, a fitting end to a weapon that had written a small but significant footnote in the vast bloody story of the American Civil War.